And just taking your seats again. Yes. Thank you. So now we come to the final formal part of this afternoon, which is a round table discussion. So I would encourage any comments or questions, as I say, on specific papers or to specific speakers, but also more generally on the novel itself, and we'll see who's happy to pick up. Indeed, it may be someone from the audience who is better placed to answer some questions as well. And I'd encourage you both to ask questions as well as answer them if you can. I'm going to call on Marion first, actually, if I may, because you didn't get a chance to ask your question earlier. So if you'd like to start us off, Marion.
Thanks very much. Well, I have a couple, but I'll leave the other one for later. Somebody else might bring it up. But my question at that time was directed towards Angus, and it was just when you were talking about whether or not Walter did ever encounter Peter or Patrick Peebles in court or around the hallowed precincts of Parliament House, I suddenly was reminded of that other notorious barrack room lawyer, Mr. Saddletrees from Heart of Midlothian, who was always in Parliament House and always knew far more than the advocates did, needless to say. And it led me on to think, you know, in connection with what you were saying, as to whether or not these vexatious litigants and barrack room lawyers, like him and Peebles, might have been haunting the place, possibly in the case of Peebles, because I wonder whether he was what we would now call a litigation friend at all. And you know, I wonder whether he ever managed to insinuate himself into somebody else's case, because we know, with you and I know party litigants, I'm afraid, all too well. And this is precisely the sort of thing that they do nowadays. Do we know whether people used to do that in those times?
Well, I personally don't know. But you think that Peter Peebles might have hung around Parliament Hall and given advice to other litigants?
We know Saddletrees did.
Yes.
Always knew far better
Yes.
than the advocate who was at the fore.
The Saddletrees, I don't think Peebles, I can't say this, in the novel, I don't think Peebles was a great lawyer. Saddletree is.
Yes, he knew himself.
Yeah.
There's a question here. Thank you.
Also on the subject of Peebles, at the end of the edition that I've got, there is a conclusion by Dr. Dryersdust.
Yes.
And I didn't know whether that was part of the novel or not, but it does include, he said, the writer of this letter got the story from a caddie, that Peter lived 10 years after King George's accession,
Yes.
in the momentary expectation of winning his cause every day in the session time and every hour of the day, and at last fell down dead in what my informer called a perplexity upon a proposal for a composition being made. That seemed to be a wonderfully comic outcome, and I wonder if it bore any resemblance to the truth, or whether it forms part of the book.
It's very strange that postscript, if we can call it that, survives into the Magnum edition, where Scott tells us, so if I can go back, you said rightly that the postscript states, or at least implies, that Peter Peebles died about 1770. And it is strange that it survives into the edition where Scott puts his own note to the effect that he thought that he acted for Peter Peebles in 1792. Is it careless editing, or does it? I don't know what to make of this. But it's quite funny, isn't it, that the poor man died of a stroke when someone proposed to settle the case.
lady at the back, thank you.
Well, we got through the whole thing without actually mentioning Redgauntlet, and for me he's one of the most attractive characters in Scott. And I wonder if anyone has any idea where Redgauntlet himself came from.
There is an interesting academic article looking at the history of the Herries family who were one of the notable families in southwest Scotland, and tracking features of the history of that family into the history of the Redgauntlet family as it's portrayed by Scott. So I think there is a real life connection between the Herries of Burnswark, the Redgauntlets, and a real family. Burnswark's a Roman fort in Dumfriesshire. The Herries didn't actually have a connection with it, so there's a bit of conflation going on there. And I can't now remember whether the article identifies any of the real-life Herries as the model for Redgauntlet in the novel. They were certainly Catholic, they were certainly Jacobite, as were the Maxwells. And interestingly, as time moved forward, the heir to the Herries of Tyrregels, which was the family in Dumfriesshire, and the Maxwells of Nithsdale, Colonel Maxwell Scott married Monica, Scott's granddaughter. And in fact, I think she was the only surviving Scott descendant at the time, and the Maxwell Scotts, who later lived at Abbotsford, the descendants both of Scott on the one hand, and the Maxwells and the Herries, who perhaps are the real life figures for Redgauntlet on the other.
John Gibson Lockhart asserts in his memoir of the life of Scott that he initially wanted to call it Herries. That was the working title before Redgauntlet came along. And there was a huge argument, according to Lockhart, between the publisher and the author about the title. But meticulous research by Wood and David Hewitt has shown that that was not the case, and that Scott rapidly adopted Redgauntlet when it was suggested by James Ballantyne, his printer, an old friend.
There's also some evidence that Scott was aware of theories that traumatic incidents could be passed down generations, and in Redgauntlet, it's the case of the horseshoe, on the forehead of all the descendants of the Redgauntlet family. So there were writing about that. I think John Galt was also interested in that idea. So there are quite a lot of different kinds of influences swirling around in Redgauntlet.
Yeah, well, just picking up absolutely on that point, really, Professor Fielding, you mentioned the Confessions, which came out in the same year, and you just talked really about the horseshoe thing, the whole question of determinism in history, because that does raise the question of determinism. Was there something in the air in the mid-1820s which made both Scott and Hogg, in two of the greatest works, thinking at the same time about how history works and whether the question of free will and determinism and in politics and history and in religion. It's amazing that those two books appeared almost in the same year. What do you feel that there's a kind of overlap between them in terms of the concerns?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a particularly well worked out answer. I'm sure you're right. That does sound very plausible to me. There's an element of coincidence, obviously, that they should both be published in the same year, 1824. But I think that a lot of the sort of mid-1820s novels are quite reflective of history itself. I was talking a little bit in my own paper about that sense that I think we have that things changed in 1820, that was the kind of the last of the rebellions in England and Scotland, and there weren't many sedition trials after that. There had been a whole string of sedition trials at the High Court in Edinburgh from the 1790s up until about 1820. There were a couple after the Coburn Notes. So I think it was just a point of reflection and looking back on a period that had been quite disturbed. And I think the fact that both Scott and Hogg choose events that didn't happen or that can't be said to have happened. So obviously there was no third Jacobite Rising, and as you know, Confessions is all about it is impossible to say what happened. The sort of freeing up, I think, of exactly what you say, the possibility of things being historically determined, being something really difficult to tell at that point. It was a very good question.
Eric?
The edition I've got here is Oxford University 1982. Was I paying too little for it when I bought it second hand? Because the real question is, for the new Edinburgh edition, did they find any egregious errors or printer mistakes when they eventually did several in the latest edition? I'm really looking for an excuse to buy the most modern one. There is much new found when I'm going into the old text here, particularly the 1832 one, which has got this marvellous essay by Scott reflecting, 8 years after the event. Is there much difference? We don't have all the academics. Any academics here that were working on the Edinburgh edition that have any notes?
I see Ian Brown sitting with his copy.
Mr. Brown, therefore.
He's certainly a fan of that.
Is there any serious difference between my paperback and the end product that you now expensively produce?
Well, there's a very extensive emendation list, which I'm looking at now,
right,
which extends in the Edinburgh edition from page 412
right,
to 439. So all these are differences between the Edinburgh edition as we have it and the manuscript and the first edition and the Magnum text and all these things. So well worth your forking out, Eric. On the Edinburgh edition. Of course, they are really expensive, but I'm lucky enough to have this one.
I think Mr. McClay is once upon a time going to do a deal. Yeah. Thank you.
I did work on a different novel in the Edinburgh edition, not that one. So I don't know the answer, although Ian can, I'm sure, show you his copy, and then you can decide. What tended to happen was that the Magnum changes more in the earlier volumes, the volumes that were originally published earlier. So Scott didn't make as many changes to the novels that he had written more recently.
I think as lunch is beckoning, we'll bring this formal part to a close, but do please continue questions and conversations over our lunch. Just before we do fully come to an end, though, I'm going to take off my chairing hat and put back my honorary secretary hat and responsibilities. I mentioned earlier that Saturday the 19th of October will be our club visit to the National Galleries of Scotland to look at the extensive amount of work connected to Scott and his writings. But before then, we've got a very exciting speaker and opportunity. Professor Jerry Carruthers, well known to us for his work on Scott, but also well known for his work on a host of all other Scottish literary matters, will be speaking to us on the Edinburgh and borders of Sir Walter Scott and Muriel Spark. This is a joint event with the Muriel Spark Society, so I hope we can turn out and show them a warm welcome. This will be on Thursday the 12th of September here at the club. Lee does have tickets available for you to purchase now, or you can contact him via email to make the arrangements for that. I'll not give you the rest of the programme. You should have the newsletter and it will be up on the website. This was a new, or relatively new format for the symposium, or colloquium. We have in the past had two keynote speakers or different arrangements. So it would be useful for me to get some feedback on how you felt today went. If you'd like us to try and copy some version of this for future ones. Similarly, we'll be, as a committee, looking at possible themes for next year. I'm tempted to break away from the bicentenaries of the novels because 1825-26 is the period of Scots journal, which I think is a particularly interesting part of his writing. So if there's enough suggestions of potential speakers, we could make the journal the focus. But we're open to suggestions from all of the membership as to what you would like to see next year's colloquium on. I know it seems a far way off, but it's always good to get a good early start on these things. That's my updates as far as secretary goes. I think it's been a thoroughly enjoyable panel discussion, as well as some interesting papers. But I would like to call on Professor Sir Ian Torrance to give the formal vote of thanks. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for. Now, I wasn't actually expecting to give the vote of thanks, and I, to be honest, didn't even know who was speaking. However, what I will do, if I may, is say a few appreciative words about each presentation. Now, first, Penny Fielding spoke to us about spy novels. And she spoke about the sense of radical uncertainty which gripped society, mistrust in government, mistrust in the authorities. And this set the tone for all of what followed. And it was, of course, is, of course, somewhat reminiscent of today, unhappily. David Purdie, in a characteristically perceptive and highly informed presentation, showed us one image after another. He explained to us how the novel and its themes had been concealed, the story that Walter Scott had been working on The Witch, by concealing his autobiographical intent. He had concealed this from Daniel Terry, who produced the dramatizations of so many of Walter Scott's novels within weeks of the novel appearing, so that Walter Scott himself called them terrifications. David Purdie showed us the grave of Wandering Willie or Pritchard. I didn't know of this. I'm fascinated. And again, thank you, David, for the way you set the scene. Ian Chisholm spoke to us about late Jacobitism, Irving's missing document, Charles Edward Stewart as the possible king, and Hamilton's understanding of the prerogatives of the President of the United States. Again, absolutely fascinating in light of where we are today and the disputed question of where a prerogative lies. Lord Wolffe, thank you. I mean, your references to Gatehouse and Fleet, your childhood in that area, all of that was fascinating. Also your comments on law on both sides of the border, the outlaws and the forces of disorder, and its foil in Joshua Geddes, the person who finally was provoked beyond endurance. Lord Stewart, absolutely fascinating. The legal profession in the early 19th century, the figure of poor Peter Peoples, or Patrick, and giving us a quotation from Patrick Peoples' own feelings, which was extremely interesting. Scott's nostalgia for the old Court of Session and the relationship between Chambers and Walter Scott. Yesterday I read Sandy McCall Smith's latest novel, which is it's about Isabel Dalhousie, one of his characters, and the title is something like The Conditions of Unconditional Love.
Now, Sandy and I actually went to the University of Edinburgh in the same year, in '67, he to do law and I was to do philosophy. We've known each other a very long time, and he is actually kind enough to bring me into a number of his novels. And so actually I brought into the most recent one, which I read yesterday as a response to his courtesy. Now, one of the things in this novel is a description of an absolutely poisonous book reading club in the area of Pakistan. I mean, utterly toxic. And the people in the club dismissed Walter Scott as being utterly unreadable. You don't read Walter Scott today. Now, actually, I last reread Redgauntlet perhaps 2 years ago. And I think actually of all of Walter Scott's novels, it is probably the least readable, I think, and the least accessible today, because it begins with that most peculiar construction, lengthy exchange of letters, which I suppose the modern reader is not used to. However, when you, as it were, get behind that, it is an immensely interesting and thoughtful and perceptive novel. David referred to his new way of presenting this symposium, and I've been to a number of these, and let me say to our speakers, this was the most successful I have ever attended. The range, the wisdom and perception, the background, all of this was enormously helpful, and I and all of those who have come, we are most grateful. I think this was extremely successful, so thank you.
So it's time now for lunch, which will be served through in the castle room. So I hope you can all stay and enjoy that and continue the conversation. Thank you.